What if I told you that one single chapter in the Bible contains the secret that connects every hero of faith across thousands of years? A chapter so powerful that it defines what faith actually means, yet so honest that it doesn't hide the brutal truth about suffering. Hebrews 11 isn't just another Bible passage. It's the Hall of Fame where you'll find a murderer's brother, a man who never died, a 90-year-old woman who gave birth, and warriors who conquered kingdoms. But here's the twist. It also celebrates those who were tortured, sawed in half, and died in caves wearing animal skins. This chapter will challenge everything you think you know about faith. It will show you that sometimes faith opens prison doors, and sometimes it gives you strength to stay in chains. It reveals why Abraham walked into the unknown, why Moses chose slavery over royalty, and why some believers the world rejected were actually too good for this world. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Hebrews 11 might be the most important chapter in the entire Bible, and why your own faith story is connected to every person mentioned here. The writer of Hebrews understood something crucial. Before you can tell stories about faith, you need to explain what faith actually is. So right at the beginning of chapter 11 in verse 1, he wrote these words, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." Think about that for a moment. Faith isn't just wishing really hard that something will happen. It's not crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. The text says, faith is substance. It's real, it's solid, even though you can't hold it in your hands. It's evidence of things you can't see with your eyes. Imagine you're standing in an empty field, and someone tells you there's going to be a house built there. You don't see any house yet. There's no foundation, no walls, no roof. But you believe that house is coming because you trust the person who told you. That belief, that confidence, that's what faith looks like. The writer chose his words carefully. He didn't say faith is hoping for things we want. He said it's confidence in what we hope for. There's a difference. Hope by itself can be weak, like wishing on a star. But confidence? That's standing firm because you trust the one who made the promise. And notice the second part. Faith is assurance about what we don't see, not what we can't understand, not what seems impossible, but specifically what we don't see. Your eyes might tell you one thing, but faith tells you something different. Your circumstances might look hopeless, but faith says God's word is more real than what's in front of you. This definition became the measuring stick for every story that follows in this chapter. Every person mentioned in Hebrews 11 demonstrated this kind of faith. They held on to promises they couldn't see yet. They believed in things that hadn't happened yet. And they trusted God even when everything around them said they were foolish to do so. The text doesn't apologize for this definition. It doesn't say faith is easy or that it always makes sense. It simply states what faith is. A confident trust in God's promises. Even when you have no physical proof, those promises will come true. The first person mentioned after this definition is Abel, and his story takes us all the way back to the beginning of human history. Abel was the second son of Adam and Eve, which means he was among the first humans ever born. And his story is found in Genesis chapter 4. Abel and his brother Cain both brought offerings to God. Verse 4 of Genesis 4 tells us that Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions, and the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. But when Cain brought fruit from the ground, God didn't accept it the same way. Now here's what matters. Hebrews 11 verse 4 explains why. It says, "By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts." It wasn't about whether sheep were better than vegetables. It was about Abel's heart. He brought his offering by faith. He believed God, he trusted God, and his gift reflected that trust. Cain's offering came from a heart that wasn't right with God. But the story gets darker. Cain became angry that God accepted Abel's offering and not his. Genesis 4:8 records what happened next. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. The first murder in human history happened because of jealousy over worship. You'd think that would be the end of Abel's story. He died young, killed by his own brother, and never got to have a family or grow old. But here's where it gets interesting. Hebrews 11:4 continues, "And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks." How does a dead man still speak? Genesis 4:10 gives us the answer. After Cain killed Abel, God said to Cain, "The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground." Abel's blood cried out. Even in death, his righteous offering and faithful heart kept testifying. Thousands of years later, when the writer of Hebrews composed this chapter, Abel was still speaking. His example of faith wasn't buried with his body. His story continued to teach every generation that came after him. Faith isn't about the size of your gift, it's about the sincerity of your heart. After Abel's story of faith ending in death, Hebrews 11 introduces someone whose faith led to something completely different. Verse 5 says, "By faith Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found, because God had taken him." Enoch's story comes from Genesis chapter 5, in the middle of one of those long genealogies that lists who lived, how long, and then died. The pattern repeats over and over. Someone was born, they lived a certain number of years, they had children, and then they died. Born, lived, died. Born, lived, died. But when you get to Enoch, something breaks the pattern. Genesis 5:24 says simply, "Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." He didn't die, he just wasn't there anymore. The text tells us Enoch lived 365 years, and during that time he walked with God. That phrase, "walked with God," appears only twice in Genesis, once for Enoch and once for Noah. It means Enoch lived in close relationship with God, in constant fellowship, in daily communion. Think about what it means to walk with someone. You're going in the same direction, you're moving at the same pace, you're spending time together, you're communicating. That's what Enoch did with God for 365 years. And then one day Enoch was walking with God, and he just kept walking right into eternity. He didn't get sick, he didn't grow old and weak, he didn't have a funeral. God simply took him. Hebrews 11:5 explains why this happened. Before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. Enoch's faith pleased God so much that God decided death wasn't necessary for him. He just brought Enoch home without the usual process. Then verse 6 makes a statement that applies to everyone. "And without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who seek him." Enoch believed God existed, and he sought God every single day. His whole life was built around walking with God, and God rewarded that faith by giving Enoch something no one else had experienced. He bypassed death entirely. The disappearance of Enoch proved something powerful. When you walk closely with God, when your faith drives you into deeper relationship with Him, impossible things become possible. Natural laws don't have the final say. Death itself doesn't have to be the end of the story. After Enoch walked with God, the Bible tells us that human wickedness grew so terrible that God decided to flood the entire earth. But there was one man whose faith stood out. Hebrews 11:7 introduces him this way. By faith Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear constructed an ark for the saving of his household. Let's understand what Noah faced. Genesis 6:13-14 records God's warning. I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. God told Noah to build a massive boat, 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high, according to the measurements in Genesis 6. But here's the thing. It had never rained before. The earth was watered by mist and streams, not by rain falling from the sky. So Noah was being told to build a boat to survive a flood caused by something that had never happened. Genesis 6:22 records Noah's response. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. No arguments, no excuses, no asking for proof, just obedience. Imagine being Noah's neighbor. You watch this man spend years, decades even, building an enormous wooden vessel on dry land. You ask him why, and he tells you God is going to flood the world, but it's never rained. There's no ocean nearby. The whole thing seems completely insane. 2 Peter 2:5 calls Noah a herald of righteousness, which means he didn't just build silently. He preached, he warned people. For what tradition suggests was 120 years, Noah worked on that ark and told people judgment was coming. And no one listened. Hebrews 11:7 says Noah acted in reverent fear. He took God's warning seriously. While everyone else laughed and went about their normal lives, Noah kept building. Every plank of wood was an act of faith. Every nail he hammered was a declaration that he believed God's word over his own eyes. The verse continues, "By this he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith." Noah's faith did two things. First, it condemned the world around him. His obedience highlighted everyone else's disobedience. Second, it saved his family. Genesis 7:1 records God's words, "Go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." When the rain finally came, when the fountains of the deep burst open and water covered the earth, that ark Noah built became the difference between life and death. 8 people survived the flood: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. Every other person on earth perished. Noah's faith wasn't passive. It required daily work, persistent action, and unwavering trust in God's word. Despite having zero physical evidence that a flood would come, he believed what he couldn't see, and he acted on that belief for decades. After the flood, humanity multiplied again, and eventually God chose one man to become the father of a special nation. Hebrews 11:8 introduces him. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. Abraham's story begins in Genesis chapter 12. He was living in Ur of the Chaldeans, a prosperous city in ancient Mesopotamia. He had family, property, and stability. He was 75 years old, an age when most people are settled and comfortable, not looking for adventure. Then God spoke to him. Genesis 12:1 records the call. "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Notice what God didn't say. He didn't give Abraham a map. He didn't tell him the destination's name. He didn't explain how long the journey would take. He just said, "Go, and I'll show you where when you get there." Verse 4 tells us what Abraham did. So Abram went, as the Lord had told him. He packed up his entire household, his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, all their possessions, all their servants, and started walking. Think about the faith that required. Abraham couldn't tell his wife, "We're moving to Canaan." He could only say, "We're moving somewhere, and God will tell us when we arrive." He couldn't plan the route because he didn't know the destination. He couldn't estimate the travel time because he didn't know the distance. Hebrews 11:8 emphasizes this point. He went out, not knowing where he was going. That's the definition of radical faith. He obeyed the call, even though the destination was unclear. But God didn't just ask Abraham to leave, he also made promises. Genesis 12:2-3 records them. "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Abraham would become a great nation. His name would be great. All families on earth would be blessed through him. These were massive promises. But here's the problem. Abraham and Sarah had no children. Sarah was barren. How do you become a great nation when you can't even have one child? Abraham didn't know, but he believed God anyway. He left everything familiar, his home, his extended family, his culture, and walked toward a promise he couldn't yet see fulfilled. Genesis 12:5 tells us they arrived in Canaan. And verse 7 says, "Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, 'To your offspring I will give this land.'" Only after Abraham obeyed did God reveal that this was the place. The destination came after the decision to follow. The promise God made to Abraham required something impossible: children. But Abraham's wife Sarah couldn't have children. She was barren, and as the years passed, she grew older and older. By the time Genesis 18 rolls around, both Abraham and Sarah were far beyond the normal age for having children. Hebrews 11:11 addresses Sarah's faith. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Let's be honest about Sarah's journey to this faith, because the Bible doesn't hide the messy parts. In Genesis 18:10, 3 visitors came to Abraham and said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent entrance. Genesis 18:11-12 tells us her reaction. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" She laughed, not out loud but inside, because the whole idea seemed ridiculous. She was 90 years old. Abraham was 99. She was decades past menopause. The biological window had closed long ago, but God heard her laughter. Verse 13-14 records his response. The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." Sarah got scared and denied it. Verse 15 says, "But Sarah denied it, saying, 'I did not laugh,' for she was afraid." He said, "No, but you did laugh." God called her out. He knew her doubt, her disbelief, her internal mockery of his promise. But here's what Hebrews 11 focuses on. Despite her initial doubt, Sarah eventually believed. She considered him faithful who had promised. Somewhere between that conversation and the birth of her son, Sarah's laughter of disbelief transformed into faith, and God kept his promise. Genesis 21:1-2 records the fulfillment. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. When the baby was born, Abraham named him Isaac, which means laughter. Genesis 21:6 records Sarah's response, and Sarah said, "God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me." The laughter of doubt became the laughter of joy. Sarah's story proves that faith doesn't mean you never doubt. It means you move from doubt to trust. It means you let God's promises override what your circumstances tell you. Her body said impossible, but God's word said it would happen, and eventually she believed him more than she believed biology. Years passed, and Isaac grew from a baby into a young man. He was the miracle child, the son of promise, the one through whom God said he would make Abraham's descendants as numerous as the stars. Everything God had promised depended on Isaac. Then God asked Abraham to do the unthinkable. Genesis 22:1-2 records the command, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham." And then he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Offer Isaac as a burnt offering. Kill your son. Sacrifice the child of promise. Hebrews 11:17 describes what happened next. By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son. The next morning, Genesis 22:3 tells us, Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Abraham didn't delay. He didn't argue with God. He got up early and started the journey. For 3 days they traveled toward Mount Moriah. Can you imagine what those 3 days were like? Every step taking him closer to the moment when he would have to kill his own son. When they arrived at the mountain, Abraham told the servants to wait. Genesis 22:5 records his words, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Notice he said, "We will come again." Both of us. Even in this moment, Abraham believed somehow both he and Isaac would return. Hebrews 11:18-19 explains his thinking. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. Abraham reasoned that if God promised to make a nation through Isaac, and God commanded him to sacrifice Isaac, then God would have to raise Isaac from the dead. The promise couldn't fail, so death couldn't be the end. They climbed the mountain together. Genesis 22:7-8 records their conversation. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." Abraham built the altar. He arranged the wood. He bound Isaac and laid him on the altar. He took the knife. Genesis 22:10 says, "Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son." At that exact moment, verse 11-12 tells us, "But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.'" God stopped him. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket. Genesis 22:13 says, "And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son." Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And God renewed his promises, swearing by himself that he would indeed bless Abraham and multiply his descendants, because Abraham had not withheld his only son. The faith that Abraham demonstrated didn't end with him. It passed down through the generations, and Hebrews 11 makes sure to highlight 3 more men who carried that faith forward. Isaac, Jacob and Joseph. Hebrews 11:20 says, "By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau." Isaac's moment of faith came near the end of his life. Genesis 27 records how Isaac, when he was old and his eyes were dim, blessed his sons. He blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things that hadn't happened yet, future promises, future inheritances, future destinies. Isaac believed that his words, spoken in faith, would shape the future of his children. He trusted that God's promises would continue through the next generation. Even though he couldn't see how it would all unfold, he spoke blessings over what was to come. Then there's Jacob, Isaac's son. Hebrews 11:21 tells us, "By faith Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff." This moment is recorded in Genesis 48. Jacob was in Egypt, far from the land God had promised to Abraham. He was dying in a foreign country, but he didn't let that shake his faith. When Joseph brought his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to Jacob for a blessing, Jacob crossed his hands and put his right hand on the younger boy's head, blessing them both. He spoke about how God had been his shepherd all his life. He spoke about the promises God had made. And Genesis 47:31 tells us that Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed, or as another translation puts it, his staff, in worship. Even in Egypt, even while dying, Jacob worshipped God and blessed the next generation based on promises that still hadn't been fully realized. He believed God's word about the future more than he believed the present circumstances. Finally, there's Joseph. Hebrews 11:22 says, "By faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Joseph's story is remarkable because he rose from being a slave to becoming the second most powerful man in Egypt. He had every reason to see Egypt as his home, but Genesis 50:24-25 records his final words. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." Joseph was dying in Egypt, but his faith was in Canaan. He knew his people wouldn't stay in Egypt forever. God had promised them a different land, and Joseph believed that promise so firmly that he made his family swear to take his bones with them when they left. 400 years later, when Moses led Israel out of Egypt, Exodus 13:19 tells us, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the sons of Israel solemnly swear, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here." Joseph's faith literally outlasted his death by centuries. His bones became a testimony to every generation that followed. God keeps his promises, even if you don't live to see them fulfilled. Isaac blessed the future he couldn't see. Jacob worshipped while dying in exile. Joseph made plans for a promise that would take 400 years to fulfill. Each generation passed the faith forward, trusting that what God had begun, God would complete. Generations after Joseph died, a new king came to power in Egypt who didn't remember what Joseph had done for the country. The Israelites had multiplied and become numerous, and Exodus 1:8-10 tells us this new Pharaoh saw them as a threat. He said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." So Pharaoh made the Israelites slaves, forcing them into hard labor. But they kept multiplying. The more they were oppressed, the more they grew. Pharaoh tried harder measures, commanding the Hebrew midwives to kill every baby boy at birth. But Exodus 1:17 says, "The midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live." When that didn't work, Pharaoh issued a public decree. Exodus 1:22 records his command. "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Every Hebrew baby boy was to be thrown into the river and drowned. Into this nightmare, a baby was born. Hebrews 11:23 tells us what his parents did. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Exodus 2:2 gives us more detail. "The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. His mother looked at this baby and saw something special." Acts 7:20 describes him as beautiful in God's sight. His parents recognized something about this child that gave them courage to defy Pharaoh's order. For 3 months they hid him. Every time that baby cried, they risked discovery. If they were caught, they would likely be executed along with their child. But they chose faith over fear. When Moses got too big to hide anymore, his mother came up with a plan. Exodus 2:3 says, "When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank. She put him in a waterproof basket and set him in the Nile, the very river where Pharaoh had commanded Hebrew boys to be killed. But she wasn't abandoning him. She placed him where Pharaoh's daughter came to bathe, and she had Moses' sister watch from a distance." Exodus 2:5-6 records what happened. "Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, 'This is one of the Hebrews' children.' Moses' sister quickly appeared and asked if she should find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Exodus 2:9 tells us, "And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages.' So the woman took the child and nursed him. Moses' mother not only got her son back, she got paid to raise him. The baby, sentenced to death, became a prince in the house of the very man who ordered his execution." The faith of Moses' parents saved more than just their son. That baby would grow up to lead the entire nation of Israel out of slavery. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace with every luxury Egypt could offer. Acts 7:22 tells us, "Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in his words and deeds. He had the best education, the finest food, servants at his command, and a future of power and wealth ahead of him." But Moses knew he wasn't really Egyptian. He knew he was Hebrew, and when he was 40 years old, he made a choice that would change everything. Hebrews 11:24-26 describes his decision. By faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Moses refused his Egyptian identity. He walked away from the palace. He turned his back on wealth and status and power. Why? Because he chose to identify with God's people, even though they were slaves. Acts 7:23-24 gives us the moment this became visible. When he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man and avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. Moses saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and he couldn't stand by anymore. He killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. The next day, Moses tried to break up a fight between two Hebrews. Exodus 2:14 records one man's response, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses realized his act had become known, and Exodus 2:15 tells us, "When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian." Everything was gone. The palace, the position, the comfort, all of it lost. Moses went from being a prince to being a fugitive. He ended up in the wilderness and spent the next 40 years herding sheep in the desert. From the world's perspective, Moses made a terrible choice. He threw away everything for nothing. But Hebrews 11 says it was faith. Moses wasn't thinking about immediate comfort. He was looking at eternal reward. He valued God's approval more than Egypt's treasures. The text says, Moses considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than all of Egypt. Moses understood that identifying with God's people meant sharing in their suffering. And he believed that suffering with God's people was worth more than all the wealth Egypt could offer. Moses looked at two paths: a life of ease in Egypt that would end, or a life of hardship with God's people that would lead to eternal reward. He chose the harder path because his faith could see beyond the temporary to the eternal. 40 years after fleeing Egypt, Moses encountered God in a burning bush and received an assignment: go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let God's people go. After a series of devastating plagues, Pharaoh finally released the Israelites. Exodus 12:37 tells us, and the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. But Pharaoh changed his mind. Exodus 14:5-7 describes what happened. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed. So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. Egypt's entire army pursued Israel, and God led the Israelites to camp beside the sea. They were trapped, water in front, mountains on the sides, and Pharaoh's army closing in from behind. Exodus 14:10-12 records the people's terror. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, The Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." The people panicked, but Moses responded with words of faith. Exodus 14:13-14 records what he told them. "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." Then God spoke to Moses. Exodus 14:15-16 gives the command. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground." Hebrews 11:29 summarizes what happened next. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. Exodus 14:21-22 describes the miracle. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. The sea stood up like walls on both sides. The ground underneath was dry. 2 million people walked through with their children and animals. All night they crossed while the water stood frozen in place. When the last Israelite reached the other side, the Egyptian army charged into the sea after them. Exodus 14:27-28 records their destruction. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled into it, and the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the host of Pharaoh that had entered the sea after them, not one of them remained. Every Egyptian soldier drowned. Moses had stretched out his staff over water, believing God would do the impossible. And God split the sea, made a highway through it, and destroyed Israel's enemies in one night. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Israel finally entered the promised land. Moses had died, and Joshua was now leading the people. The first major obstacle was Jericho, a fortified city with massive walls. Joshua 6:1 describes the situation. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. The city had locked itself down. The walls were impenetrable, but God had a different plan. Joshua 6:2-5 records his instructions. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat. March around the city. Blow trumpets, shout." That was the battle strategy. No weapons, no siege equipment, just walking and making noise. Hebrews 11:30 describes what happened. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. Joshua gave the orders to the people. Joshua 6:10 records his command. "You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." For 6 days they marched around Jericho in complete silence, except for the trumpet blasts. Imagine being a soldier on Jericho's walls watching this. Israel's army wasn't attacking, they were just walking in circles. On the 7th day, they didn't stop after 1 lap. Joshua 6:15 tells us, "On the 7th day they rose early at the dawn of day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. 7 times they circled the city that day." Then Joshua 6:16 records the moment, "And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, 'Shout.' "For the Lord has given you the city," the people shouted. Joshua 6:20 describes what happened next. "So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him. And they captured the city. The walls didn't crack or crumble gradually. They fell down flat, collapsed completely. For 7 days, Israel had obeyed instructions that made no military sense. They trusted God's word over their own understanding of warfare. And when they shouted, God brought those walls down. Before Israel attacked Jericho, Joshua sent 2 spies into the city to scout it out. Joshua 2:1 tells us, "And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there." Rahab was a Canaanite, part of the people Israel was coming to destroy. She made her living as a prostitute. By every measure, she should have been on the wrong side of this story. But something had happened in Rahab's heart. Joshua 2:9-11 records what she told the spies. "I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." Rahab had heard about Israel's God. She had heard about the Red Sea parting, about victories over other nations, and she believed. She recognized that Israel's God was the true God. When the king of Jericho heard the spies were in Rahab's house, he sent soldiers to capture them. But Rahab hid the spies on her roof under stalks of flax. Joshua 2:4-5 records her deception. "But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. And she said, 'True, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. Pursue them quickly, for you will overtake them.' The soldiers left to search for the spies. Rahab had just committed treason against her own city. If discovered, she would be executed. But she had made her choice. She went to the spies and asked for mercy. Joshua 2:12-13 records her request. "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them." The spies agreed. Joshua 2:18 gives the instructions. "Behold, when we come into the land, you shall tie this scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. And you shall gather into your house your father and mother, your brothers, and all your father's household, a scarlet cord in the window." That would be the sign. Everyone in the house would be saved. Rahab helped the spies escape down the wall through her window. She tied the scarlet cord in her window and gathered her family. When Jericho's walls fell, Joshua 6:22-23 tells us what happened. "But to the 2 men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, 'Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her.' So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and mother and brothers and all who belonged to her." Hebrews 11:31 summarizes her story. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient. Because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies, every person in Jericho died that day except Rahab and her family. A Canaanite prostitute became part of Israel, and Matthew 1:5 lists her in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. A scarlet cord in a window saved Rahab's life. Her faith brought her from death to life and into the family line of the Messiah. After Joshua died, Israel entered a dark period recorded in the book of Judges. Hebrews 11:32 begins listing these judges, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. The writer admits he's running out of time. But even in this rapid listing, we can see something important. These weren't perfect people. Gideon was hiding when God called him. Judges 6:12 records the angel's greeting. "The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor.'" but Gideon didn't feel mighty. Judges 6:15 records his response, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." Gideon asked for multiple signs before obeying. Yet God used him to defeat the Midianites with just 300 men. Barak's story is in Judges 4. God told him to go fight Sisera's army. But Judges 4:8 records Barak's response, "If you will go with me, I will go, but if you will not go with me, I will not go." He refused to fight unless the prophetess Deborah came with him. Yet God gave him victory. Samson was set apart as a Nazirite from birth, meant to be holy to God, but Samson kept breaking his vows. He married a Philistine woman. He visited prostitutes. He fell in love with Delilah, who betrayed him. Judges 16:20-21 records his tragic fall, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes, yet even blind and imprisoned. Samson's final act of faith brought down the temple of Dagon. Jephthah was rejected by his family and became the leader of outlaws. When Israel needed someone to fight the Ammonites, they came to him. He agreed, but Judges 11:30-31 records a rash vow, "If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering." When his daughter came out first, the vow cost him terribly. Yet God still used him to deliver Israel. These 4 men all had significant flaws, but Hebrews 11 lists them as examples of faith. God didn't wait for perfect people. He used willing people. Among all the judges and kings, 2 names stand out, Samuel and David. Samuel's story begins before his birth. 1 Samuel 1:11 records his mother Hannah's prayer, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life." God answered her prayer. When Samuel was weaned, Hannah brought him to the tabernacle to serve under Eli the priest. 1 Samuel 3:19-20 describes Samuel's calling, "And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord." Samuel became the last judge and the first prophet to establish a prophetic tradition in Israel. He anointed Israel's first 2 kings. David's story is even more remarkable. 1 Samuel 16:11-13 records how God chose him. Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. David was a shepherd boy, the youngest son, not even considered important enough to bring to the meeting with the prophet. But God chose him. David's faith showed immediately. When Goliath challenged Israel, David was the only one willing to fight him. 1 Samuel 17:45 records David's declaration, "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David killed Goliath with a sling and a stone. He became a mighty warrior and eventually king. 2 Samuel 8:15 summarizes his reign. "So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people." David wasn't perfect. He committed adultery and murder. But when confronted, he repented deeply. His faith in God never wavered. Samuel established the prophetic voice that would speak God's word to Israel for generations. David established a kingdom and a dynasty through which the Messiah would eventually come. After listing specific names, Hebrews 11:33-34 suddenly accelerates, "Who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight." These are things that should be impossible, yet faith made them happen. Stopped the mouths of lions. This points to Daniel. When jealous officials tricked the king into making a law that anyone who prayed to anyone but the king would be thrown into the lion's den, Daniel kept praying to God anyway. Daniel 6:16 records his punishment. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The next morning, Daniel 6:21-22 records what happened. Then Daniel said to the king, "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me." Daniel's faith kept him safe in a den of hungry lions, quenched the power of fire. This refers to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they refused to bow to King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue, they were thrown into a furnace, heated 7 times hotter than normal. Daniel 3:27 describes the result. The fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Were made strong out of weakness. This happened repeatedly throughout Israel's history. Weak people became strong through faith, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. David defeated the Philistines. Jehoshaphat saw God destroy 3 armies without his soldiers fighting. The point is clear. Faith produces results that human ability cannot explain. When people trust God and act on that trust, impossible things happen. Lions become harmless. Fire loses its power. Weak people become strong. Small armies defeat large ones. Everything changes at verse 35. Up until this point, Hebrews 11 has been celebrating victories. Walls falling down, seas parting, lions' mouths shut, fire losing its power. Faith has looked like triumph after triumph after triumph. But then, right in the middle of verse 35, the text takes a sharp turn. The verse begins with more victories, women receiving back their dead by resurrection. But then it says, some were tortured, refusing to accept release, so that they might rise again to a better life. Wait, what? These people were tortured. They had a chance to go free. They could have been released. But they refused. They chose to keep suffering because they believed in a better resurrection that was coming. This is the moment when Hebrews 11 stops being a comfortable chapter. This is where faith stops looking like success and starts looking like something much harder to understand. The writer doesn't apologize for this shift. He doesn't try to soften it or explain it away. He just presents it as fact. Some people of faith saw miracles, and some people of faith were tortured to death. Think about what this means. Faith doesn't guarantee a happy ending in this life. It doesn't promise that you'll always escape danger or that God will always deliver you from suffering. Sometimes faith means enduring when there's no escape coming. These believers were tortured. The word used here suggests they were stretched on a rack, a torture device that slowly pulled their bodies apart. And they were given a choice: deny your faith and go free, or keep believing and keep suffering. They chose suffering, not because they wanted to suffer, but because they wanted something better. They believed that if they stayed faithful, even through torture and death, God would give them a better resurrection. They were looking past this life to the next one. This is faith too. It's not the kind of faith that makes good marketing material. You can't make an inspiring movie about someone who just suffers and dies. But Hebrews 11 says this is faith at its deepest level, believing God's promises, even when those promises won't be fulfilled until after you're dead. The chapter is forcing us to reconsider what successful faith looks like. Is faith only successful if you escape? Is it only real if God delivers you? Or can faith be just as real, just as valid, just as pleasing to God when it simply endures without rescue? Not all heroes escaped. Some heroes endured, and the text presents both as equally faithful. Verse 36 continues listing what some believers faced. Others suffered mocking and flogging, and even chains and imprisonment. These weren't minor inconveniences. Mocking meant public humiliation, being paraded through streets while crowds laughed at you, spit on you, threw things at you. Your faith became entertainment for people who hated what you believed. Flogging was brutal. The Romans used whips with multiple leather strands, each embedded with pieces of metal or bone. They would tie a person to a post and beat their back until the flesh was shredded. Many people died from flogging alone. Those who survived carried the scars for life. Chains meant being bound like an animal. Your hands and feet locked in iron, your movement restricted, your dignity stripped away. Imprisonment in the ancient world wasn't like modern prisons. There were no trials with set sentences. You could be thrown in a cell and forgotten. Many dungeons were underground pits, dark, damp, infested with rats. Food was scarce. Disease was common. People died in those prisons and no one cared. The chapter acknowledges that some believers experienced miraculous prison escapes. Peter's chains fell off and an angel led him past sleeping guards. Paul and Silas sang hymns and an earthquake opened all the doors, but others didn't get earthquakes. Others didn't get angels. They stayed in those chains. They remained in those prisons. They endured the mocking and the flogging and the darkness. Their faith wasn't vindicated by supernatural rescue. Their faith was vindicated by supernatural endurance. Think about what it takes to remain faithful in a prison cell when no angel comes. Think about the strength required to keep believing when you've been publicly humiliated and physically beaten. Think about holding on to God's promises when every day brings more suffering and there's no indication that it will ever end. That's a different kind of miracle. Not the kind where circumstances change, but the kind where the person endures despite circumstances. Not the kind where God removes the suffering, but the kind where God gives strength to suffer with dignity. The text doesn't say these believers were weak or that their faith was insufficient. It doesn't suggest that if they had believed harder, God would have rescued them. It simply acknowledges that faith sometimes means staying faithful through suffering that never ends in this life. Some believers saw prison doors fly open. Others died in their cells. Both groups had faith. Both groups pleased God. The outcome doesn't determine the validity of the faith. Verse 37 gets even more specific about how some believers died. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. Stoning was a method of execution where a crowd would throw rocks at a person until they died. It was slow and painful. Stephen experienced this in Acts 7. He was preaching about Jesus when the crowd turned on him. Acts 7:57-58 tells us, "But they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and rushed together at him. Then they cast him out of the city and stoned him, as the rocks hit him, breaking bones and crushing his skull." Acts 7:59-60 records his final words. "And as they were stoning Stephen, he called out, 'Lord Jesus, receive my spirit.' And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, 'Lord, do not hold this sin against them.' And when he had said this, he fell asleep. Stephen died praying for the people who were killing him." That's faith facing death without flinching. Sawn in two. This is horrific. Tradition says this happened to the prophet Isaiah. According to Jewish writings, when the evil King Manasseh ruled Judah, Isaiah was placed inside a hollow log and sawed in half. The text doesn't confirm the details, but it confirms that some believers died this way. Imagine the faith it takes to endure that, to know what's coming and not recant, to hold on to God even when facing that kind of death. Killed with the sword. This was a common method of execution. James, the brother of John and one of Jesus' apostles, died this way. Acts 12:1-2 records it simply, "About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword." No miraculous escape. No angel intervention. Just execution. James was killed because he followed Jesus, and that was that. These weren't failures of faith. These were faith's ultimate expression. These believers valued God's approval more than their own survival. They demonstrated that faith can face death without flinching. The chapter doesn't present these deaths as tragedies to be mourned or puzzles to be solved. It presents them as testimonies. These people proved that nothing, not torture, not humiliation, not even the most brutal death, could separate them from their faith in God. They could have saved their lives by denying their faith. They chose death instead. That's not weakness. That's not failure. That's faith refusing to compromise no matter what the cost. Verse 37 continues, "They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated." Some faithful believers never knew stability or safety. They couldn't stay in one place. They had to keep moving, keep hiding, keep running. Society didn't just reject them, it hunted them. They wore animal skins because they had no proper clothing. They were destitute, meaning they had no money, no possessions, no resources. They were afflicted, constantly facing hardship and suffering. They were mistreated, persecuted by the people around them. Verse 38 adds more detail. "Of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains, and in dens and caves of the earth." Think about what this describes. These believers lived in deserts, hot, barren places where survival was difficult. They hid in mountains, cold, remote areas far from civilization. They found shelter in dens and caves, dark holes in the ground where animals lived. This was their reality, not for a few days or weeks, but for years, some for their entire lives. They never had homes. They never had security. They never had comfort. Why did they live this way? Because they refused to deny their faith. Because the world wanted them to either conform or disappear, and they chose to disappear rather than conform. The prophets often lived like this. Elijah hid by a brook and was fed by ravens. He later lived in a cave, running from Queen Jezebel, who wanted him dead. 1 Kings 19:9-10 records his words while hiding in that cave. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life, to take it away." Elijah was alone, hunted, hiding in a cave. And he was one of God's greatest prophets. During times of persecution, believers have always had to hide. They've lived in catacombs under cities. They've met in forests at night. They've disguised their faith and lived as fugitives in their own lands. The text doesn't romanticize this. It doesn't say they were happy about living in caves or that they enjoyed their poverty. It simply acknowledges that this is what happened. Some believers who remained faithful lost everything: their homes, their possessions, their place in society, their safety. Yet they persisted in faith. They kept believing even when belief cost them a normal life. They proved that faith in God doesn't depend on comfortable circumstances or social acceptance. You can have nothing and still have faith. You can be rejected by everyone and still be accepted by God. Right in the middle of verse 38, there's a statement that reframes everything: "of whom the world was not worthy." Stop and think about what this means. These believers were rejected, hunted, forced to live like animals. The world treated them as worthless, as people who didn't deserve to exist. But God's perspective was the opposite. The world wasn't worthy of them, not the other way around. The world that persecuted these believers wasn't superior. It was unworthy of their presence. The people who mocked them, who tortured them, who drove them into hiding, those people were the ones who were lacking, not the believers. Their poverty was the world's loss. Every believer who was killed was a light that the world extinguished. Every prophet who was silenced was a voice of truth that the world refused to hear. Every faithful person who died was someone the world needed but rejected. Their deaths were the world's crime. God didn't see these martyrs as victims who lost. He saw them as witnesses whose suffering exposed the world's evil. Think about Stephen again. As he was being stoned, Acts 7:55-56 tells us what he saw. But he, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, "Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." Stephen saw Jesus standing. Usually the Bible describes Jesus sitting at God's right hand. But for Stephen's martyrdom, Jesus stood. It was a sign of honor, of recognition, of respect. The world was killing Stephen, but heaven was honoring him. The martyrs weren't victims of fate. They were witnesses. Their very suffering condemned the systems that destroyed them. Their deaths proved that the world was broken, evil, hostile to God, and this statement of the world was not worthy of them flips the script entirely. It says that when the world rejects believers, the rejection says more about the world than about the believers. When society persecutes faith, it proves that society is corrupt, not that faith is wrong. This is a radical perspective. It means that suffering for faith isn't a sign that God has abandoned you. It might be a sign that you're too good for the world you're living in. Your faithfulness exposes the world's faithlessness. Your righteousness highlights the world's unrighteousness. The world wants to silence that, but God honors it. Verses 39-40 bring us to the chapter's most uncomfortable truth. And all these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. Read that again slowly. All these people, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Moses, Rahab, David, the prophets, the martyrs, all of them were commended for their faith. God approved of them. They pleased him. Their faith was real and valid, but they didn't receive what was promised. Abraham was promised land, but he never possessed it. He lived in tents his whole life. Hebrews 11:9 already told us, by faith he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents. He died still waiting. Moses led Israel to the edge of the promised land, but wasn't allowed to enter. Deuteronomy 34:4-5 records his death, and the Lord said to him, this is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab. Moses saw the land from a mountain, but never walked in it. The prophets foretold a Messiah who would come and establish God's kingdom. They spoke about him, wrote about him, longed to see him. 1 Peter 1:10-11 describes their situation. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. They searched their own prophecies, trying to understand when these things would happen. But they died before Jesus was born. They never met the Messiah they foretold. This is hard to understand. Why would God make promises to people and then not fulfill those promises in their lifetime? Why would he ask them to have faith in something they would never see? The answer is in verse 40. God had a better plan. A plan that included not just the Old Testament believers, but all believers across all time. The Old Testament saints couldn't be perfected separately. Everyone had to wait for Jesus to come, die, rise, and complete the work of salvation. Faith continued believing despite delayed fulfillment. These believers held on to promises for decades, some for their entire lives, without seeing those promises come true. They died still believing, still trusting, still hoping. That teaches us something crucial. God's timetable transcends individual lifetimes. His promises are sure, but they might not be fulfilled in your lifetime. Faith means trusting God's promises even if you won't personally see them completed. Abraham believed God would make him into a great nation, but that nation didn't exist when Abraham died. Moses believed God would bring Israel into the promised land, but Moses died outside it. The prophets believed the Messiah would come, but they died centuries before his birth. Were their faith and God's promises less real because of the delay? No. The delay was part of God's bigger, better plan. Verse 40 explains why God delayed the fulfillment. Since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. God deliberately withheld fulfillment because he had a superior plan. He wasn't making the Old Testament believers wait for no reason. He was making them wait so that everyone could be included in the same salvation. The something better is the new covenant through Jesus Christ. The Old Testament sacrifices and laws pointed forward to something greater. Hebrews 10:1 explains, "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near." The Old Testament system was a shadow. Jesus is the reality. And God's plan was that everyone, Old Testament and New Testament believers, would be saved the same way, through Jesus. The phrase, "apart from us, they should not be made perfect," means the Old Testament saints couldn't reach their final, complete salvation without New Testament believers also being saved. God wasn't going to perfect them separately and then perfect us later. Everyone would be perfected together. Think about what this means. Abraham is waiting. Moses is waiting. David is waiting. All the prophets are waiting. They're all in heaven, but they're waiting for the full completion of God's plan. And that completion includes you if you have faith in Jesus. Everyone reaches the finish line together. This makes faith a collective journey rather than individual competition. You're not just running your own race. You're part of a much larger race that includes believers from every generation. God's plan was always to create one family of faith that included people from every time period. Jews and Gentiles, Old Testament and New Testament, people who lived before Jesus and people who lived after Jesus, all saved the same way, all part of the same family, all reaching perfection together. This is why the delay mattered. If God had fulfilled everything immediately for the Old Testament believers, they would have been in a separate category. But God wanted everyone together, saved by the same Savior, perfected by the same grace. The Old Testament believers believed promises about a coming Savior they never met. New Testament believers believe in a Savior who already came. But both groups are trusting the same God and looking forward to the same eternal future. God had planned something better, not just better for New Testament believers, but better for everyone. A plan where no one is left out, where every generation is included, where faith connects all believers across all time into one unified family. Though this technically moves into Hebrews 12, the chapter's conclusion connects directly to what comes next. Hebrews 12:1 opens with, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." All these faithful people from Hebrews 11, they're now described as a cloud of witnesses surrounding us. The image is of a stadium filled with spectators watching athletes run a race. And we're the athletes. They're the crowd watching, but they're not just watching passively. They're witnesses in two senses. First, they witnessed to their faith. Their lives testified to God's faithfulness. Second, they're now witnessing our lives. They're aware of the ongoing story of faith. Their examples aren't just historical records. They're living testimonies that still speak today. Abel's blood still speaks. Hebrews 11:4 told us that through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. His example of wholehearted worship still challenges believers today. Enoch's walk still inspires. His life of close fellowship with God reminds us that it's possible to walk with God daily. Abraham's obedience still instructs. His willingness to leave everything and follow God's call teaches every generation what faith looks like in action. Moses' choice still convicts. His decision to suffer with God's people rather than enjoy temporary pleasure confronts our own choices about comfort versus faithfulness. The martyr's endurance still encourages. Their refusal to deny faith, even facing torture and death, strengthens believers who face opposition today. The chapter transforms past saints into present coaches. They ran their race. Now they're cheering you on as you run yours. Their faith becomes the inheritance of everyone who believes after them. This is why Hebrews 11 matters. It's not just a history lesson, it's a family album. These are your spiritual ancestors. Their faith is your heritage. Their endurance is your encouragement. Their victories and their sufferings both testify to the same truth. God is faithful, and faith in Him is never wasted. You're running the same race they ran. You're trusting the same God they trusted. You're part of the same family they belong to. And one day, you'll join that cloud of witnesses. And your faith will encourage the generations that come after you. The story of faith didn't end with Hebrews 11. It continues with every believer who chooses to trust God despite circumstances, despite delays, despite suffering, despite not seeing the full picture. Faith connects all of us, past, present, and future, into one continuous testimony of God's faithfulness across all generations. If this video encouraged you, helped you understand Hebrews 11 better, or gave you a new perspective on what faith really means, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button right now. We're creating more content that breaks down the Bible in clear, simple ways, and I want you to be here for every video. And here's the second thing. Share this video with someone who needs it. Think about the people in your life right now. Who's struggling with their faith? Who's waiting for answers that haven't come? Who needs to hear these stories? Send them this video. Share it on your social media. Help us spread this message about real, honest, biblical faith. Your faith matters. Your story matters. You're part of this same family that includes Abraham, Moses, David, and all the others. One day, your faith will encourage someone else to keep going. Thanks for watching. Keep believing. Keep trusting. Keep running your race. God sees you, He knows your struggles, and He's faithful. Always has been, always will be.